Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Speak Smart podcast. I'm so excited for today's deep dive because we're going to be talking about something that's super close to my heart. Books. Specifically, how reading, and maybe more importantly, talking about what we read, can be like this secret weapon for leveling up your English skills.
Yeah, it's funny, right? We talk about reading so much when it comes to language learning, but we kind of forget about just the power of chatting about what we read.
Exactly. Like, it's not just about taking in the words on the page. It's about really processing them, making them your own. That's where the magic happens. And for this deep dive, we're going to be looking at this awesome podcast called Book Talk with Sophia and James.
They're a great resource because they actually break down like the why and the how of using book discussions to boost your English.
Right. They even talk about how it ties into the bigger picture of how we learn languages in general.
Well, yeah, think about it. You don't pick up a language by just, sitting there and listening to it. You got to use it, right? You got to play with it, make mistakes, experiment,
It's like that analogy they made in the podcast about learning a musical instrument.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was a good one. They were saying, you wouldn't expect to just, pick up a guitar and shred just by reading sheet music.
Exactly. You need to practice, mess up a bunch of times, hopefully have a teacher who can give you some feedback, and slowly you get better.
And it's the same deal with language. Talking about books, it gives you that active practice, that chance to actually use all those cool words and grammar rules you've been learning.
And not only that, it forces you to really think about what you're saying, to find those precise words to describe what you're feeling and thinking.
And I think another thing they really hit on that's super important is the whole fun factor, When you're enjoying something, you're going to learn so much better.
Oh, absolutely. If it feels like a chore, you're way less likely to stick with it. But when you're excited about it, when you're actually having fun, that's when the learning really sinks in.
And, part of that fun can come from connecting with other people, sharing your love for a book, debating different interpretations.
I love that. And Book Talk actually gives a really cool framework for introducing a book that you're excited about.
It's like a little blueprint for how to get someone else hooked, And it's so simple but effective.
They start with the basics.
Yeah.
The title and the author. Then they say you should give a super quick rundown of the plot, just enough to pique someone's interest without giving away any spoilers.
It's almost like a little movie trailer for a book.
And then finally, they say to mention the genre. That way the person knows what kind of vibe to expect, right? Is it a thriller, a romance, a sci-fi epic?
It's like setting the stage for the conversation. And what I think is really smart about their approach is that it's not just about rattling off facts about the book.
Yeah, it's more about capturing that excitement, that passion that you have for the book, and sharing that with someone else.
Exactly. So you're not just giving information, you're inviting them into this world that you've discovered. And then Book Talk goes a step further and talks about how to really dive into the meat of the book, how to discuss the content in a way that pushes your understanding and your English skills.
Right. It's not just about retelling the story. It's about really digging deep, analyzing the characters, figuring out what the themes are, and sharing your own thoughts and reactions.
Yeah, that's where things get interesting. Instead of just surface level stuff, we're starting to look at why things happen, what motivates the characters, the bigger picture.
And Book Talk breaks it down into those 4 key areas we talked about. So you've got discussing the plot, obviously. Then there's analyzing the characters, figuring out what makes them tick.
Then there are the themes, those big ideas that the author's trying to get across.
And then, of course, there's the part where you get to share your own opinions, which, let's be honest, is usually the most fun part, right?
Totally. So let's break down each of those areas a bit more, starting with the plot. They had some cool suggestions for how to talk about that in a way that helps you practice your English.
Okay, so what do they say?
Well, they recommended using things like those words that show the order of events, like first, next, and finally.
Oh, that's smart. It not only helps you organize your thoughts, but it also forces you to use those words in a natural way. I mean, we use those kinds of words all the time in conversation, right?
It's like building a timeline with your words. And then when it comes to characters, they suggested going beyond just describing what they look like or what they do in the story.
Yeah, they said to really get into their heads, right? What are their motivations? Why do they do the things they do? How do they change throughout the story?
And that kind of analysis, that's where you really start to use some higher level vocabulary, like adjectives to describe personality, verbs to talk about emotions, all that good stuff.
It's amazing how discussing a book can lead you to use language in ways that you never even thought of before. And then there are the themes, which I think can be the most challenging to talk about, but also the most rewarding.
I agree. They suggested asking yourself, okay, what are the big ideas here? What is the author trying to say about life, about the world?
It forces you to think critically, to look beyond just the surface of the story.
And remember, there's no single right answer when it comes to themes. It's all about your own interpretation.
Which is what makes it such a great opportunity for discussion.
Yeah.
You can hear how other people interpreted the same book, and maybe that changes your perspective a bit.
Exactly. And Book Talk even suggested coming up with your own questions about the themes to spark even more discussion. Like, you could ask, do you think this theme is still relevant today? Or how did this theme make you feel?
Those are great examples. And throughout the discussion, they emphasize the importance of sharing your own opinions, your own gut reactions to the book.
Like, did you love it? Did you hate it? Why? What parts resonated with you?
And it's a great chance to practice using those phrases like I think and I feel and in my opinion. Those are essential for expressing yourself clearly in English.
And remember, it's totally fine to disagree with someone else's opinion, as long as you do it respectfully.
Yeah, sometimes those disagreements are actually the most interesting part of the conversation because they challenge your thinking, and they might even make you see the book in a whole new light.
Exactly. It's all about that back and forth, that exchange of ideas. Now, one thing that I thought was really cool that Book Talk did was they had this segment where they read letters from their listeners about their favorite books and what those books meant to them.
Oh yeah, that was a really nice touch. It just shows how powerful stories can be, how they can connect us, even if we're from totally different backgrounds.
And it really highlights the idea that there's no right or wrong way to read a book. Everyone brings their own experiences and perspectives to the table, and that's what makes those discussions so rich.
It's not just about, memorizing facts or mastering grammar rules. It's about using language to connect with other human beings, to share your thoughts and feelings, and to explore different worlds and ideas.
And I think that's a perfect lead-in to the next part of our deep dive, where we'll be talking about some of my personal book recommendations for English language learners. And then we'll dive into Book Talk's advice on actually building that consistent reading habit, which I know a lot of people struggle with.
I can't wait.
All right, so we've talked about all the good stuff that comes with discussing books, but now let's get practical. Like, how do we actually have these conversations, in a way that helps us really practice and improve our English?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. Like, it's one thing to know that we should be talking about books, but how do we actually make it happen?
Well, Book Talk had some really helpful tips for that, like how to structure your thoughts, how to keep the conversation going, that kind of thing.
Okay, so what do they suggest?
Well, for starters, when you're talking about the plot, they recommended using those words that show the sequence of events, like first, then after that, those kinds of words.
Oh yeah, that makes sense. It helps you organize your thoughts and tell the story in a clear way.
And it also gives you a chance to practice using those time-related words, which are super important in any language.
Right. And then what about when you're talking about the characters?
They said to go deeper than just describing what they look like or what they do.
Okay, so like what's going on inside their heads?
Exactly. Like, why do they make the choices they make? What are their motivations? How do they change and grow throughout the story?
That's where things get really interesting, right?
Yeah. And it also pushes you to use a wider range of vocabulary, like adjectives to describe personality traits, verbs to talk about their actions and emotions, all that good stuff.
I love that. So you're not just retelling the story, you're really analyzing it, digging into the psychology of the characters.
Exactly. And then, of course, you've got the themes, which I think can be the most challenging to talk about, but also the most rewarding.
I agree. Like, how do you even start talking about themes?
Well, Book Talk suggested asking yourself some key questions, like, what are the big ideas that the author's exploring? What is the book trying to say about the human experience, about the world we live in?
Oh, those are good questions.
Yeah.
It's like you're trying to figure out the deeper meaning behind the story, right?
Exactly. And remember, there's no single right answer when it comes to themes. It's all about your own interpretation, your own unique perspective.
And that's what makes it so perfect for discussion, right? Because everyone will have a slightly different take on it.
Right. And you can learn so much from hearing how other people interpreted the same book. You might even discover something new about the story that you hadn't even considered before.
That's so true. It's like each person brings a different lens to the book.
Yeah.
And you get to see it through all these different perspectives.
Exactly. And Book Talk even suggested coming up with your own thought-provoking questions about the themes to spark even more discussion. Like you could ask, do you think this theme is still relevant today? Or how did this theme make you feel? You know, stuff like that.
I love that. It's like you're taking the conversation to a whole new level. And of course, throughout the discussion, it's important to remember to keep coming back to your own personal opinions.
Like, don't be afraid to say, I think, or I feel, or in my opinion, you know? Those are great phrases to practice using because they help you clearly state your viewpoint.
And they also signal to the other person that you're sharing your subjective interpretation, not claiming to have the absolute truth.
Right. And remember, it's totally fine to disagree with someone else's opinion as long as you do it respectfully, you know?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes those disagreements can actually be the most interesting part of the conversation. They make you think harder, and they might even change your mind about something.
Absolutely. It's all about being open to different perspectives and being willing to challenge your own assumptions. Now, there was one thing that Book Talk did that I thought was really cool. They had this segment where they read letters from their listeners about their favorite books and what those books meant to them.
Oh, yeah, that was really touching.
Oh,
Like, it just shows you how powerful stories can be, how they can connect us on such a deep level, even if we come from completely different backgrounds.
exactly. And it really drives home the point that there's no one right way to read a book. Everyone's going to have a different experience with it. And that's what makes those discussions so enriching.
It's not just about, understanding the plot or analyzing the characters. It's about how the book makes you feel, how it resonates with your own life experiences.
Exactly. And that's what makes talking about books such a great way to practice your English. You're not just learning grammar rules and vocabulary words. You're using language to express your thoughts and feelings, to connect with other human beings, and to explore different worlds and ideas.
I love that. Okay, so I think we've covered the how-to of book discussions pretty well. Now, I'm dying to hear about some of your personal book recommendations for people who are learning English. Got any favorites you want to share?
Oh, absolutely. I've got a whole list of books that I think are perfect for English language learners depending on their interests and their current reading level. Are you thinking more along the lines of like light and fun reads or something a little more challenging and thought-provoking?
Good question. Let's start with something light and entertaining. Something that's easy to get into and doesn't feel like homework.
Okay, perfect. So for a light and fun read, I would definitely recommend The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. It's a heartwarming fantasy novel with a really charming cast of characters and a beautiful message about acceptance and inclusivity.
Ooh, that sounds lovely. I might have to check that one out myself. What about something a little more classic, like one of those books that everyone should read at some point in their lives?
Yeah. Well, you can never go wrong with Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. It's a timeless romantic comedy with witty dialogue, complex characters, and a fascinating glimpse into English society in the 19th century.
I've always wanted to read that one. Okay, so we've got something light and fun, something classic and romantic. Now, what if someone's looking for something a bit more suspenseful, something that will keep them on the edge of their seat?
Ooh. For a suspenseful read, I would recommend The Silent Patient by Alex Michaelides. It's a psychological thriller with a really twisty plot, unreliable narrators, and a shocking ending that will leave you guessing until the very last page.
Ooh, that sounds intense. I love a good thriller.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got a few different genres covered. Now, what if someone's feeling a bit more ambitious? Like they want something that will really push their English skills and make them think deeply about the world.
Okay, for a more challenging read, I would suggest The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. It's a dystopian novel that explores some really important themes like gender, power, and religious extremism in a way that's both chilling and thought-provoking.
Wow, that sounds like a powerful book. It's amazing how a single story can spark so many important conversations about society and the human condition.
It really is.
Okay, so we've talked about some specific book recommendations, but how do you actually go about finding those perfect books that are both enjoyable and aligned with your current English level?
Yeah, that's a good question. There are so many books out there, it can be overwhelming to know where to start.
Absolutely. And Book Talk actually has some great advice on that. They emphasize the importance of using resources like online book communities, personalized recommendation services, and even just asking friends, family, or teachers for suggestions.
I love that. It's like there's this whole community of book lovers out there who are eager to help you find your next great read. Exactly. And don't forget about those best of lists, like the New York Times bestsellers or award-winning books. Those can be a good starting point too.
And of course, there's always the good old-fashioned method of just browsing the shelves of your local library or bookstore.
Nothing beats that feeling of discovering a hidden gem. All right. So we've talked about book recommendations. We've talked about how to find the right books for you. And we've talked about how to have those engaging and beneficial book discussions. I think we've covered a lot of ground.
We have. And I feel like we've barely scratched the surface of what Book Talk had to offer.
Yeah.
There was just so much good stuff in that podcast.
I know, right? But I think we've given our listeners a great starting point. Now it's up to them to go out there and actually start putting these ideas into practice.
Exactly. So for anyone who's feeling inspired to start reading and discussing books in English, don't be intimidated. Just remember to start small, find books that you genuinely enjoy, and most importantly, have fun with it.
That's the key. And the final part of our deep dive, we'll circle back to Book Talk's advice on choosing books that match your specific language level. And we'll wrap up with some final thoughts on how to really embrace this whole journey of learning English through reading.
All right, so we've talked about finding those perfect books, but there's this elephant in the room, right? How do we actually know if a book is the right level for us?
Oh, that's such a good point. It's like you don't want to pick up a book and just hit a wall of super complicated vocabulary and grammar that you just don't understand, right?
Exactly. It can be so demotivating.
Yeah, and Book Talk actually had some really helpful tips on how to assess a book's difficulty level before you commit to reading the whole thing.
Okay, I'm all ears. Spill the secrets.
Well, one of the simplest things they suggested was just to read the first few pages.
Oh, that's so obvious, but I never really thought about it that way.
Right. But it makes so much sense. If you're reading those first few pages and you're constantly having to stop and look up words, or you're just completely lost with the sentence structure, that's probably a sign that the book might be a little too advanced for you right now.
Okay, that makes sense. So what if the first few pages seem okay? Are we good to go?
Well, it's a good starting point for sure. But Book Talk also suggested checking out things like online reviews. Often, readers will mention if a book is particularly difficult or easy to read, or if it uses a lot of slang or technical jargon.
Oh, that's a smart tip. I always forget to check reviews. Okay, so what if we've done all that and we're still not sure? Any other tricks up your sleeve?
Well, they also talked about this really cool thing called graded readers.
Graded readers. What are those?
So basically, they're books that are specifically designed for language learners.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, they use simplified language and grammar, and they often include things like glossaries and comprehension questions to help you along the way.
So it's kind of like having training wheels for reading, right?
Exactly. It's a great way to ease yourself into reading in English without feeling overwhelmed. And another thing they suggested was starting with books that you might already be familiar with in your native language.
Oh, that's a good idea. If you've already read the Harry Potter books in your own language, why not try reading them in English?
Exactly. Because you already know the plot and the characters, you can really focus on the language itself, and it can be a fun way to kind of rediscover a story that you love.
That's brilliant. I love that idea. Okay, so say we found the perfect book. It's the right level. We're excited about it. Now, how do we make sure we actually stick with it? Make reading a regular habit.
Ah, the million-dollar question, right? Book Talk had some really great advice on that too. They really emphasize the importance of consistency, making reading a part of your daily routine.
Okay, so how do we do that?
Well, they suggested trying to set aside a specific time each day for reading, even if it's just for 15 or 20 minutes.
Oh, I like that. It's like scheduling a meeting with yourself, a reading date.
Exactly. And they also talked about creating a comfortable and inviting reading environment.
With a cozy chair and a warm blanket and a cup of tea.
Exactly. Or maybe you prefer reading outside in nature or at a coffee shop. It's really about finding what works best for you and creating a space where you can really relax and focus on the story.
I love that. It's all about making reading a pleasurable experience, not a chore.
And you know what else they suggested? Carrying a book with you everywhere you go.
Oh, that's a good one. For those times when you're waiting in line or commuting, or just have a few minutes to spare.
Exactly. Instead of just mindlessly scrolling on your phone, you can squeeze in a few pages of reading. It all adds up,
That's so true. Okay, so we're being consistent. We've got our cozy reading nook all set up. We're carrying a book everywhere we go. Mm-hmm. What else can we do to make sure we stick with this whole reading habit thing?
Book Talk talked about the importance of tracking your progress, which I think is really helpful.
Oh yeah, like using a reading journal or an app or something.
Exactly. It's just a way to kind of visually see how much you're reading and to celebrate your milestones, whether that's finishing a chapter, a book, or even just reading consistently for a week.
It's like giving yourself a little pat on the back for all your hard work. I love that. And speaking of celebrating, they also talked about rewarding yourself for reaching your reading goals.
All right. Yes. Like maybe you treat yourself to a new book or a special coffee drink or something. It's just a little way to kind of reinforce that positive behavior and make reading feel even more enjoyable.
I know all about those little rewards. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've talked about the power of discussing books to improve our English. We've explored how to actually have those discussions in a way that's both fun and beneficial. We've talked about finding the right books for our level. And we've even gotten into the nitty-gritty of building a consistent reading habit. I feel like my brain is bursting with new ideas.
I know, right? It's been such a fun and insightful journey exploring Book Talk with you. They really packed so much wisdom into their podcast. But I think the biggest takeaway for me, and hopefully for our listeners too, is that reading should be a source of joy, not a chore.
100% agree. If a book isn't grabbing you, don't force yourself to finish it. There are millions of amazing books out there just waiting to be discovered.
Exactly. So don't be afraid to experiment, explore different genres, and find what truly sparks your interest. And remember, the journey of learning English through reading is a marathon, not a sprint.
So true. Be patient with yourself, celebrate those small victories along the way, and most importantly, have fun with it. It's all about embracing the adventure of exploring new worlds and ideas through the magic of storytelling.
Beautifully said. And on that note, I want to thank everyone for joining us on this deep dive into the world of books and reading. I hope you've learned some valuable tips and feel inspired to continue your own English language journey through the power of stories.
And a huge thank you to Book Talk with Sophia and James for providing such a wealth of knowledge and inspiration. We'll definitely be checking out more of their episodes in the future. So to all our listeners out there, what are you waiting for? Grab a book, find a cozy spot, and get reading.
Happy reading, everyone.
And thank you for listening to the Speak Smart podcast. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a fascinating topic to help you on your English language learning journey. Until then, keep practicing, keep exploring, and keep speaking smart.